So more so recently, there's been times where I've been having to make some tools, or I've been having to make something for MotionBuilder, where I need to get information from what the user has actually pressed or changed or done inside of MotionBuilder itself. Nothing to do with a UI that we've created, or nothing to do with something external. Something that is a signal which is being generated by the native UI which MotionBuilder has itself, be that selecting something in the scene itself, or just even like moving the timeline or something like that. And that in itself, or getting those pieces of information back from MotionBuilder in order to use them in your UIs, can sometimes be a little bit mysterious. How to actually figure that stuff out. um, if anybody's used to using Maya, you'll know that the callback system inside of Maya is pretty damn good with mel commands and whatnot, to try and just give you some information as to what's actually going on in the scene at any given point. When you click something, when you move something, all this kind of business. And to quickly go over what we're going to be doing in this kind of tutorialization set of videos, is we're going to be going over the very basics of getting callbacks from MotionBuilder, so you can then use MotionBuilder itself and the UI that you're clicking on, or the items that you're clicking in the scene, and using that information real time in order to, say, populate another UI, or to get a constant read of what frame that you're on, or something like that. Again, this is something that if you're working strictly in the Python editor, and you're using kind of like conventional methods of grabbing data and stuff, you could find that you try and enter a while loop or something, and because MotionBuilder has a single thread for computing all of its Python on, you're going to find that you're going to be hanging there for a very long time, and sometimes even your applications or your scripts might crash. So yeah, we're going to be looking at the basics of creating callbacks for MotionBuilder. Essentially, a callback is, from what we say here, an executable piece of code that is passed as an argument to other code. And the way that I kind of put this into layman's terms is, if I click something, then that's obviously going to trigger a function inside of MotionBuilder to do something like, set there to be like a green outline of the wireframe of what you've selected, all of the stuff that needs to happen there, the properties window to show and stuff like that, and give you all of that information. A callback is essentially something that returns from that function itself to say, hey, I've done the thing, or I have done the thing. And there are two different types of callbacks that we can have. We can have synchronous callbacks and asynchronous callbacks, and they sound exactly like they are, okay? So with a synchronous callback, you could imagine that you'd click something, and instantly you would get that feedback back, you would get that data back. And an asynchronous one being, the opposite to that. You click something, or you do something, and that callback is then almost stored for the right time for it to present itself and to be used. When we are starting to create our callbacks inside of MotionBuilder, or should I somehow, I'll use the term piggyback, let's use that instead. There are three main areas that we're going to be looking at. And to just to go very broadly over how the callback system kind of works inside of MotionBuilder, um, when you click something inside of MotionBuilder, or when you say move the timeline or something, um, in the back end there, a lot of functions are being called, right? You're clicking on a cube, it needs to know, the wireframe, it needs to know to put the properties in there. If you move the timeline, it needs to know, that the animation inside of the scene itself needs to be synchronized with what's actually going on with the timeline, and to find that frame, and to go to the proper keying position, and all of that stuff, right? So there are things in the background which are running these functions in order to synchronize all of this data, and to also to give you a visual feedback in the scene as to what's actually going on. Um, but again, inside of Python, it's not necessarily super obvious or super well documented as to how you actually go about getting that information back in, say, the basic form, a print statement, so you can actually see what's going on, and then being able to get that into a single script that you can run from a UI perspective, and then in order to get that back as a variable, and then to do something with that piece of information. So the way that this basically works is, there are certain functions inside of Python which are referencing these larger functions that happen for, say, synchronizing an event, or when you when you open a new file, or when you merge a new file, or all of these different kinds of things. These functions are somewhat exposed inside of Motion Builder for Python, right? So the concept of what we need to do with these functions is we need to, and I've used this term just, we need to be able to piggyback on top of what these larger functions do in order to inject our own functions. So every single time you click a cube or something, not only does it do all of the standard motion builder functions for giving an outline, uh, populating the properties pane and stuff like that. But right at the end there, we can just add in our own little thing to say, oh, and by the way, print me back, the name of the model. Print me back, whatever. Grab me the X value of this particular thing once something's been clicked, and that is essentially the meat and veg of what a callback is. There are three main areas which we're going to look at, and there are probably a ton more, but these are the ones that I found the most useful in the small amount of time that I've been working with these. Um, and these aren't necessarily the callback functions themselves. We'll get into that, but there are three main areas inside of the API that we are going to be using to call in order to get to these functions. And you've probably used them a million times before if you've done any Python scripting. But we're going to be using FB system. And I've written a few little notes here for each one of these and what they actually kind of handle from my perspective. But FB system handles connecting notifications, such as connecting a cube to a keying group that you create in the scene, connecting information to the scene, so the properties pane, as well as connecting whether something has actually been selected, and that's all through FB system, right? So when we actually come to use FB system, you'll see that we can click on the cube. It will give us a callback as to whether we've selected something, we've deselected something. It'll also be able to show that that the keying group has been applied and stuff like that. We're not going to go too deep into all of these. All I want to do is I want to give a general idea as to what you could use these things for. One that piggybacks off FB system, and it's something that I haven't really found a super useful way to use it yet, and that is a couple of functions which come off the back end of scene. Now, I'm sure a lot of people have watched Alex Forsyth's videos where you can do just a standard recursive loop through, scene.components, and you can find everything which is a component inside of your scene, and then you can kind of pull back certain things. But scene itself has something pretty interesting in there, which is basically an on-change function. As I say, I haven't really found a decent use for it yet. The other ones seem to do a pretty good job of the stuff that I wanted to do, much more kind of reactionary, I would say. That's kind of like an offshoot of the FB system stuff that we'll be taking a look at. The next one is FB application, and that is very much for opening files, closing files, merging files, and being able to piggyback on the set of functions that you would do that for, right? So let's just take for example that you want to, every time that you open up a file, or if you open up a new file, you want a particular UI to jump up out of the screen, or you want every time you open a new file, you want a cube to be made or something like that. This is where you would find that particular set of calls in order to add your own functions in there and piggyback under what Motion Builder's actually doing in the background already. And then the last one, which I think is like super, super interesting, and it's the one which I've found the most interest in, let's say, and that is the evaluate manager and the couple of functions which come off the back end of that. And the way that I perceive the evaluation manager, sorry, the evaluate manager, not the evaluation manager, the evaluate manager, is that for me almost seems to handle all of the synchronization that happens inside of Motion Builder. One of the examples that we're going to go through at one point is the idea of moving the timeline and getting an instant read, an instant print statement back as to what frame we're actually on, right? And you won't see any slowdown, you won't see any lag, because it's all being piggybacked into that main synchronization function, right? It's not like we're having to run it through Python as its own thing. We're going to be registering our function into that core kind of call. So I mean, I don't know this for certain, but I believe that by doing this, we're kind of running it more on the C side of things, the C++ side of things, than we are the Python interpreter single thread run the script kind of things. We're kind of like throwing something over to that side of the fence and being like, hey, when you synchronize the event, run this as well for us, like, and do it super quick as well. So yeah, that's kind of like the introduction as to what we're going to be looking at. As I say, there's probably going to be 3 extra parts on top of this. But yeah, to quickly run down, callbacks are essentially, retrieving information from MotionBuilder as and when you do things to it. There are 3 main areas that we're going to be looking at, and the core concept is that we need to get our functions and we need to inject them into these other core functions which MotionBuilder already does. And by doing so, it should do all of the laundry list of stuff that it needs to do for whatever we're asking to add our stuff into. And then at the very end there, it'll do our little function as well. So yeah, I'll see you in the next video where we will start to look at the basics with on file exit and on file open and stuff like that. And yeah, hope you enjoy it.